Thank you, thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft Singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft Singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft Singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate. Just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
What they have in England? Jehovah's Witnesses. Apparently in America, we have gotten so good at hiding from these people. That they had to go to a whole other continent just to sell their quota of watchtowers. You know what amazes me about the Jehovah's Witnesses? They don't celebrate any holidays. Did you know that? No Christmas, no Thanksgiving, no Valentine's Day. They don't let their kids celebrate Halloween. I think this is a mistake. Because wouldn't trick-or-treating for a little Jehovah's Witness kid be like a training exercise? Go on, ring the doorbell. I know you don't know who lives there. Ring it! Even the ones with the lights that are off. They're home. Go ring it!
Good morning. It's Saturday, Wiker Saturday, August the 31st, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, grow up, ideas have consequences, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and the 100 books every conservative must read. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
All of the criticisms one might mount against the corporate form, some of which are valid, pale in contrast to two straightforward and indeed essential virtues. First, business makes most of the stuff we enjoy and consume. Second, business is what gives most of us jobs. The two words that follow most immediately from the world of business are prosperity and opportunity. Tyler Cowen. The contempt too many show for the concept of business can only be attributed to a covetous disdain for success. Business as the producer of our purchase habits is inherently true, and business as the place where jobs and opportunity are found is tautologically true. This leaves few logical options for why business is so often said as if it were a four-letter word.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
The Declaration. Time for another American Revolution. I'm only briefly going to address the famous part. The section they used to make even us long-suffering atheist kids actually memorize in school, like it was a speech by Chairman Mao or something. You remember the tune. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. Whoa! We don't like to hear that talk about abolishing government, because if this government of ours really was abolished, we'd all have to get real jobs, and we're not about to do that. So that's why we fight, symbolically, of course. You read this stuff about dissolving bonds, and even if you are as dumb as we think you are, you might start getting ideas about dissolving, the Democratic Party, just like the Russians did to the Communist Party after the distressing collapse of socialism in one country. Anyway, this Jeffersonian document goes on to say, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Repeated injuries and usurpations could just as easily describe our bracingly consistent MO for the past couple centuries, if you ask me. But putting that aside for a moment, the cure for what ails you lies in the next stretch, the stuff you never memorized, and probably have never even read. It's an 18th century laundry list of all beefs that the colonists had against good King George III. And it's amazing to look back on it now, because a lot of them sound suspiciously like the same beefs you people have today. Think of what follows as the halftime speech being given by the coach of a scrappy underdog team as he fires up his troops to go out there and win one for the Gipper. He has refused to assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. We've flipped this one around on its head, but the effect on you is the same. Rather than refusing assent, we enthusiastically shoved volumes of new laws down your collective throats, so hard that you're gagging on them right now. We've packed as many of your state houses as we can with our drones and trolls and their taxpayer-supported staffs, whose numbers are as uncountable as the sands on the beach or the stars in the sky, and yet growing. Every day we churn out new laws, new regulations, new executive orders, new edicts, new initiatives, all of which are designed to do one or both of the following: restrict your freedom and cost you money. And yet you sit there and take it. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. Would that this were still true. The idea of a sovereign too busy playing golf, going on date nights with his wife at enormous taxpayer expense, choppering off to Camp David as often as possible, and careening around the country waving his hands and making increasingly ineffectual speeches while the state goes to hell in a handcart, sounds like paradise even to us. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. Now, this sounds like a good idea for your side, and my recommendation is that you see it King George's way. The third, not Bush the second. Imagine taking our legislative Solons away from such gangland cribs as Washington, D.C., Trenton, Jefferson City, Sacramento, and Albany, and making them travel to some hick town in the middle of nowhere, sadly depriving them of their bars, cat houses, and bagman drops. Round up the usual suspects and drag their tails off to Gary, Indiana, or another of your dumpy little burgs, and make them stay there. A couple of days of that, and they'll be ready to repeal the entire Bill of Rights, or outlaw the practice of psychiatry, or restore the Constitution, whichever comes first.
And that was the Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Grow Up by Everett Piper.
It's a symptom. As a symptom, the reality behind the adulting jokes is malignant and reveals a stage 4 societal cancer. This terminal disease isn't just the fault of the young, but a breakdown in our culture at large. Its genesis is ideological. It stems from political and social ideas that may have seemed and appeared right at one point, but which have proven themselves through trial and error to be clearly wrong. Ideas that may have seemed novel and groundbreaking, but which have proven to break little other than the very foundation upon which America, as well as most of the Western world, has been built. Richard Weaver warned of this over 70 years ago, writing, "Ideas have consequences," in his book by the same name. His argument was simple. There's no such thing as a neutral idea. Value neutrality is a ruse. Ideas are always directional. Good ideas lead to good culture, good government, and good corporations and good communities. And bad ideas lead to the opposite. For better or for worse, individuals as well as countries and cultures are shaped by their ideas. Ideas that are grounded in truth and reality can bring great good. And conversely, ideas that spring from lies and deception always cause great harm. Navigating these ideas and choosing which ones to claim as our own is the quest for adulthood, regardless of our age. The off-trending adulting hashtag and the accompanying mindset provide damning evidence. The situation is dire for the young adults who find adulthood and its attendant responsibilities a laughing and begrudging matter. But the situation isn't just dire for those youths as individuals, it's also dire for the nation as a whole. As the younger generation grows into leadership positions, we as a people become more immersed in a culture of perpetual adolescence, mired in a banal swamp of ideological despondency. Beyond the tweets and selfies, real adulting has not yet come to pass for scores of American citizens. The Washington Times recently reported shocking data from the U.S. Census Bureau that illustrates the grim state of affairs. 35% of all 18 to 34-year-old Americans live with their parents. According to a study recently released by the Pew Research Center, 30% of millennial men between the ages of 18 and 33 have no job, 10% higher than previous generations. Of that number, approximately 8% are unemployed, while 22% are not engaged in the workforce at all. Reports across the country confirm that millennials are marrying less and later than any other generation in history. 4 out of 10 young adults in 2016 were recorded as being married, while in 1980, it was 6 out of 10. The picture does not look good for a cohort of young adults that boasts of being the most college-educated generation. We could marshal dozens of studies to confirm what we all see with our own eyes. Young Americans aren't engaging in responsible adult behavior that makes positive contributions to society. Young adults shirk the mundane tasks that form the bedrock of a mature and developed life. They're moving out of suburban homes that need cleaning and maintenance into cramped city condominiums where everything is taken care of for them. Instead of taking time to prepare dinner and carry out household chores, they're ordering takeout and spending money on needless services. Millennials are so averse to domestic normalcy that many no longer use the top sheet of their own bed. Apparently, they no longer see the obvious purpose and function of a very simple thing like sheets and bedding. Without the supervision of their parents, millennials and the generations that follow them are prolonging their teenage years. They've clenched their fists and dug in their heels as they've been pushed to adulthood, resisting with every ounce of their being. While they've resisted the natural progression of life, choosing instead to arrest their own development, they've forced their absurd, childish demands on the rest of society. The snowflake rebellion and its need for endless coddling is now playing out in every corner of American life. They don't just want to stew in their extended adolescence. They want to remake American government in their own image. They advocate for an overbearing government with policies that bring more dependency, less personal responsibility, and one could argue, more prolonged adolescence and immaturity. But lest you think I'm just blaming millennials and Gen Zers, let me be clear. Blame also lies with their parents. Many of the ideas the boomers institutionalized and the personal decisions they made have set the stage for this dysfunction. Boomer parenting was the equivalent of surgically removing a student's frontal lobe before demanding that he explain an algebraic formula, or removing a girl's legs while asking her to run a race. The prolonged adolescence, social dysfunction, and psychological fragility of the millennials is the legacy of the baby boomers. The boomers have left their progeny these qualities as an inheritance. To put it in different terms, we boomers have given our kids a culture and a country where, as C.S. Lewis warned, we have gelded the stallion and bid him be fruitful. We have removed our nation's character and expect its citizens to show courage. My generation has created men without chests and demands of them virtue. This lunacy of creating a culture of perpetual dependency is what led to my first book, Not a Daycare. It's also what brings many in the younger generations to feel the burn and fall in line with the likes of Bernie Sanders, AOC, and those who preach that socialism will cure all that ails us. The differences between the snowflake generation and their predecessors are clear for all to see. The snowflakes whine and moan and turn to false prophets on the political left. The greatest generation, that memorable group of Americans who built this country into a global superpower through hard work and sacrifice, gave everything they could to their country without expecting anything in return. No great civilization has ever made growing up and becoming an adult a joke or a hashtag. No successful culture has ever bemoaned adulthood as something to lament. And most importantly, no civilization has stretched out the start of adulthood as long as America is doing now and survived.
And that was the next part of Lesson 1. Walking is better than crawling. And I wanted to make note here that one of the things that he's missing is telling people, discussing with people, or telling these generations that are snowflakes, that why it is that they shouldn't want to be coddled. Right now, he's making the case. If I'm a snowflake, I'm thinking when he says, "Oh, well, you're making the case for bigger government that's going to coddle and blah blah." I'm thinking that sounds great to me. Why wouldn't I want that? Why wouldn't everybody want the government to coddle them? Because the flip side is the less responsibility that you are required to show, the less independence you're going to have. Okay, they got one, it goes hand in hand with the other, independence and responsibility. That's why. And when you think, hey, I got a great idea, I want to be a singer, I want to be a rapper, I want to be an MC, I want to be an artist, I want to be diddly-doodly-da, and then you find out, wait a minute, you're going to have to go to the government and get the government's permission. You're going to have to fill out all kinds of forms, and you're going to have to spend all kinds of money satisfying various government rules and regulations. That's when you're going to find out too late that having the government take care of everybody is not the way to go. People use Europe as a role model, but European people want to move to America. The ones that want to be independent move to America. Classic example, there's a guy on Instagram, he has an account on Instagram, and he's Sicilian, and he's always showing he's in various gardens and whatnot, and they're picking fresh fruit off the trees and making their lunch or whatever, and he's just luxuriating. He goes to these little restaurants and little delicatessens there in Sicily, in his little town of Sicily, and he's getting all this delicious food, and he's just yum, 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 yum. It's so fantastic. Guess where he lives? In the United States of America. He moved here recently. Why? In a word, opportunity. Yes, in Europe, you have much more safety, if you will. The government is going to protect you from things. But because they're protecting everybody from things, then they don't have the opportunities. They can't just go out and do whatever it is that they want or need to do. They have a dream about doing something in particular. Sorry, got to go to the government first. So that's the downside. And that's what the author should be reminding snowflakes, Gen Xers, whomever, about. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver, Chapter 1.
Chapter 1, The Unsentimental Sentiment. But the thing a man does practically believe, and this is often enough, without asserting it even to himself, much less to others, the thing a man does practically lay to heart, and know for certain, concerning his vital relations to this mysterious universe, and his duty and destiny there, that is in all cases the primary thing for him, and creatively determines all the rest. Carlyle. Every man participating in a culture has 3 levels of conscious reflection: his specific ideas about things, his general beliefs or convictions, and his metaphysical dream of the world. The first of these are the thoughts he employs in the activity of daily living. They direct his disposition of immediate matters and so constitute his worldliness. One can exist on this level alone for limited periods, though pure worldliness must eventually bring disharmony and conflict. Above this lies his body of beliefs, some of which may be heritages simply, but others of which he will have acquired in the ordinary course of his reflection. Even the simplest souls define a few rudimentary conceptions about the world, which they repeatedly apply as choices present themselves. These too, however, rest on something more general. Surmounting all is an intuitive feeling about the immanent nature of reality, and this is the sanction to which both ideas and beliefs are ultimately referred for verification. Without the metaphysical dream, it is impossible to think of men living together harmoniously over an extent of time. The dream carries with it an evaluation, which is the bond of spiritual community. When we affirm that philosophy begins with wonder, we are affirming, in effect, that sentiment is anterior to reason. We do not undertake to reason about anything until we have been drawn to it by an affective interest. In the cultural life of man, therefore, the fact of paramount importance about anyone is his attitude toward the world. How frequently it is brought to our attention that nothing good can be done if the will is wrong. Reason alone fails to justify itself. Not without cause has the devil been called the prince of lawyers, and not by accident are Shakespeare's villains good reasoners. If the disposition is wrong, reason increases maleficence. If it is right, reason orders and furthers the good. We have no authority to argue anything of a social or political nature unless we have shown by our primary volition that we approve some aspects of the existing world. The position is arbitrary in the sense that here is a proposition behind which there stands no prior. We begin our other affirmations after a categorical statement that life and the world are to be cherished. It appears then that culture is originally a matter of yea-saying, and thus we can understand why its most splendid flourishing stands often in proximity with the primitive phase of a people, in which there are powerful feelings of oughtness directed towards the world, and before the failure of nerve has begun. Simple approbation is the initial step only. A developed culture is a way of looking at the world through an aggregation of symbols, so that empirical facts take on significance, and man feels that he is acting in a drama, in which the cruxes of decision sustain interest and maintain the tone of his being. For this reason, a true culture cannot be content with a sentiment which is sentimental with regard to the world. There must be a source of clarification, of arrangement and hierarchy, which will provide grounds for the employment of the rational faculty. Now, man first begins this clarification when he becomes mythologist, and Aristotle has noted the close relationship between myth-making and philosophy. This poetry of representation, depicting an ideal world, is a great cohesive force, binding whole peoples to the acceptance of a design and fusing their imaginative life. Afterward comes the philosopher, who points out the necessary connection between phenomena, yet who may, at the other end, leave the pedestrian level to talk about final destination. Thus, in the reality of his existence, man is impelled from behind by the life-affirming sentiment and drawn forward by some conception of what he should be. The extent to which his life is shaped, in between these, by the conditions of the physical world is indeterminable, and so many supposed limitations have been transcended that we must at least allow the possibility that volition has some influence upon them. The most important goal for one to arrive at is this imaginative picture of what is otherwise a brute empirical fact, the données of the world. His rational faculty will then be in the service of a vision which can preserve his sentiment from sentimentality. There is no significance to the sound and fury of his life, as of a stage tragedy, unless something is being affirmed by the complete action. And we can say of one, as of the other, that the action must be within bounds of reason if our feeling toward it is to be informed and proportioned, which is a way of saying if it is to be just. The philosophically ignorant vitiate their own actions by failing to observe measure. This explains why pre-cultural periods are characterized by formlessness, and post-cultural by the clashing of forms. the darkling plain swept by alarms, which threatens to be the world of our future, is an arena in which conflicting ideas, numerous after the accumulation of centuries, are freed from the discipline earlier imposed by ultimate conceptions. The decline is to confusion. We are agitated by sensation and look with wonder upon the serene, somnambulistic creations of souls which had the metaphysical anchorage. Our ideas become convenient perceptions, and we accept contradictions because we no longer feel the necessity of relating thoughts to the metaphysical dream.
And that was Ideas Have Consequences, Chapter 1 by Richard Weaver. And I've picked this book because it was mentioned by the author of the book Grow Up. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Daily Stoic.
What's better left unsaid? Cato practiced the kind of public speech capable of moving the masses, believing proper political philosophy takes care, like any great city, to maintain the warlike element. But he was never seen practicing in front of others, and no one ever heard him rehearse a speech. When he was told that people blamed him for his silence, he replied, "Better they not blame my life. I begin to speak only when I'm certain what I'll say isn't better left unsaid." Plutarch, Cato the Younger, 4. It's easy to act, to just dive in. It's harder to stop, to pause, to think, no, I'm not sure I need to do that yet. I'm not sure I am ready. As Cato entered politics, many expected swift and great things from him. Stirring speeches, roaring condemnations, wise analyses. He was aware of this pressure, a pressure that exists on all of us at all times, and resisted. It's easy to pander to the mob and to our ego. Instead, he waited and prepared. He parsed his own thoughts, made sure he was not reacting emotionally, selfishly, ignorantly, or prematurely. Only then would he speak, when he was confident that his words were worthy of being heard. To do this requires awareness. It requires us to stop and evaluate ourselves honestly. Can you do that?
And that was the Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday and narrated by Brian Holsopple. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
If we're just talking to God in an undifferentiated way, then we're not praying in a manner different than the way a Jew or a Muslim or a general monotheist would pray. What's the Christian difference? The Christian difference is that the one God, who's displayed himself now as Father, Son, and Spirit, we pray to the Father as though the Son has his arm around our shoulder. Because the Father sent the Son into our own humanity, into our sin and death. So the Son's gone all the way out. So the Son now helps us to pray to the Father. Now, where's the Holy Spirit come in? The Holy Spirit is the love that connects the Father and the Son. In fact, now in this prayer, the Son's arm around my shoulder, directed to the Father, is a prayer in the Holy Spirit. I've been drawn into the dynamics of the love between the Father and the Son. God.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, ethics is not a mystic fantasy, nor a social convention, nor a dispensable subjective luxury to be switched or discarded in any emergency. Ethics is an objective, metaphysical necessity of man's survival, not by the grace of the supernatural, nor of your neighbors, nor of your whims, but by the grace of reality and the nature of life. Unquote. It's Ayn Rand, the objectivist ethics from the book, The Virtue of Selfishness. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the 33 strategies of war.
Like Metternich, you must operate on two fronts. You are outwardly agreeable, apparently bending to people's ideas, energy, and will, changing shape, like Proteus himself. Remember, people are willful and perverse. Opposing them directly, or trying to change their ideas, will often have the contrary effect. A passive, compliant front, on the other hand, gives them nothing to fight against or resist. Going along with their energy gives you the power to divert it in the direction you want, as if you were channeling a river rather than trying to dam it. Meanwhile, the aggressive part of your strategy takes the form of infecting people with subtle changes in their ideas and with an energy that will make them act on your behalf. Their inability to get what you are doing in focus gives you room to work behind the scenes, checking their progress, isolating them from other people, luring them into dangerous moves that make them dependent on your support. They think you are their ally. Behind a pleasant, compliant, even weak front, you are pulling the strings.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Chapter 18 of The 10 Books Every Conservative Must Read by Benjamin-Wiker, Ph.D.
The Key to the Lord of the Rings. For my own family, the key to the Lord of the Rings was the 3 magnificently produced movies that drew us into reading the book. We watched them over and over, and at the same time read the trilogy out loud in the evenings. For quite a few months, the book and the movies formed our imaginations, our intellects, our family discussions, our reading and our viewing pleasure, our jokes, our quips, and our insights. The movies are great. The book is far, far greater. The greatest insight was uttered by my wife, who before the movies wanted nothing to do with elf stories, but came to be entranced by both the book and films. One day she said, quite simply, "The Lord of the Rings lifts the veil." Tolkien, looking down, would be proud. That is exactly what he created it to do, as he makes wonderfully clear in one of the most important, intellectually thrilling essays I've ever read, on fairy stories. As Tolkien relates, this essay was written in the same period, 1938 to 1939, when The Lord of the Rings was beginning to unroll itself, and to unfold prospects of labor and exploration in yet unknown country as daunting to me as to the hobbits. The Lord of the Rings is a fairy tale, perhaps the second best one ever told. The best one, maintains Tolkien, is the Bible, in particular the Gospels. The use of the term fairy tale might seem provocative in this context, but Tolkien, the Catholic believer, tells us that the proper effect of a fairy story is precisely this. It lifts the veils covering our eyes and lets us see what is really true, what is really there. That is why the best fairy stories last, handed down from generation to generation. And one fairy story in particular, despite its fantastic nature, actually happened, the story related in the New Testament. This startling notion is central to my analysis of the Lord of the Rings and the Bible, and the conservative literary imagination, and so we had better spend some time in sorting out exactly what Tolkien means. On fairy tales. We recall Chesterton remarking about the importance of fairy stories, especially for us sophisticated moderns. Fairy tales contain more truth, said Chesterton, than the dry, gray world of the materialists who deny ordinary miracles, like free will or love or joy, and splutter that extraordinary things can't happen when they quite obviously do. Unfortunately, our grasp of the truths of fairy tales is hindered by confusion about what a fairy tale really is. As Tolkien explains at great length in his essay, the modern notion of fairies as delicate little creatures flitting about from flower to flower is a great aberration. The word fairy actually is the equivalent of elf, and elves in mythology and legend are human-sized creatures of great power. They are not to be trifled with. They are, in fact, the image of unfallen man. Created by man's imagination, they are freed from those limitations which he feels most to press upon him. They are immortal, and their will is directly effective for the achievement of imagination and desire. That is why the elves in Lord of the Rings are both great warriors and great musicians, exceedingly wise as well as whimsical. They seem angelic in their ethereal purity and more substantial than humans in their physicality. Their art and architecture blend seamlessly with nature, even while bringing it to effortless exaltation. Their food is simple, yet makes every other food taste like mud by comparison, and has almost miraculous restorative properties. They are creatures of our imagination that represent all that was possible and wonderful in our nature had it not been wounded by sin. They are creatures of man's art that shed great light on the origins and deepest aspirations of man. Tolkien's great art is, as he termed it, subcreation, the creation of a world in which elves, hobbits, wizards, dwarves, trolls, and malignant spirits exist along with men. He draws readers from their primary world into his secondary world by the power of his words, so that while we are reading, we are truly, in our imagination, living in that secondary world. He is Shakespeare's Prospero, creating illusions for the enchantment of his audience, a strange new world in which his readers can live and learn while the spell lasts. Such enchantment is not, argues Tolkien, the result of a willing suspension of disbelief, but a total immersion in the story as real, and a consequent deep desire to believe, to have and experience as real the wonders we find within. Fairy stories open a door on other time, and if we pass through, though only for a moment, we stand outside our own time, outside time itself, maybe. Rather like Tocqueville, we become a foreigner seeing our world and our time from another world and other time. The effect of this enchantment of our mind, our will, our passions, even our senses that occurs while immersed in the secondary world, provides an awakening to the extraordinary nature of reality in our primary world. We recover our natural wonder, our natural sense of adventure, our natural joy in finding ourselves alive and surrounded by the truly startling reality of our primary world. Life becomes a gift. We become enchanted and amazed once again by what we may call the permanent things, the primary things, sitting by a fire, singing a song, composing and reciting poetry, the smell of a forest, feasting, the love of husband and wife, the joy of children, the invigoration of working with our hands and minds, friendship, the courage of battle. It was in fairy stories, remarked Tolkien, that I first divined the potency of the words, and the wonder of the things, such as stone and wood and iron, tree and grass, house and fire, bread and wine. The passing enchantment of the story allows us to regain a clear view, to clean our windows, so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, so that we may again enjoy seeing things as we are, or were, meant to see them. These permanent things at the foundation of human life are what conservatism properly conserves, what it defends against all attacks, what it promotes against all odds and orcs being the demons of Tolkien's Middle-earth. That is why the entire epic of The Lord of the Rings is built around the simple life of hobbits in the towns of their shire. In the shire, we find a life worth living and worth defending against every evil. How to evoke what the shire means? I shall never forget one evening when dusk had brought in a low-lying mist that rested upon the bottom land and lapped at the hill leading up to our cabin. As I sat down below by the stream, I watched the goats crop the grass on the hillside and the fog drift over the pumpkin patch. My family was safe in the cabin, bustling about after supper, and my eldest daughter came out to sit on the porch and play the theme music of the Shire from the movie on her cheap penny whistle. Because our house nests in a hollow, the notes were naturally amplified and so seemed to come up from the ground itself. May God grant you, reader, one such moment of peace and contentment. These are the primary things: family, home, food, music, the enchanted beauty of creation, the heart of the Shire. I hope it is clear, or can become clear through reading The Lord of the Rings, that it is just such things that the anti-federalists were fighting for. Hear Tolkien's description of the ordering of the Hobbit's Shire. The Shire at this time had hardly any government. Families, for the most part, managed their own affairs. Growing food and eating it occupied most of their time. In other matters, they were, as a rule, generous and not greedy, but contented and moderate, so that estates, farms, workshops, and small trades tended to remain unchanged for generations. Hobbits are true conservatives, the anti-federalists of Middle-earth. The Shire, the life worth living and dying for. The entire adventure of The Lord of the Rings is actually about the defense of the Hobbit's Shire. It begins with the Shire and ends with the Shire. What is a Shire? A Shire is an English county, but the Hobbit's Shire is about the size of a large American county or a very small state. As with Aristotle and the anti-federalists, the towns of the Shire are the bedrock of human life. Hobbit life grows from the family outward to the town, and the many towns constitute the Shire. It is economically and politically self-sufficient and contented. The simple way of life is embedded in the change of seasons and the moderate enjoyment of the permanent things. There is no false and abstract universality. Hobbits are not all alike. As with all good things, there is blessed variation and stubborn particularity, and so we find somewhat different breeds of hobbits. The Harfoots, Stoors, and Falahides, each with his own signal traits and habits. The hobbits and their Shire are part of Middle-earth, containing other peoples and their own beloved lands, dwarves, elves, men, and even more fantastic creatures. There is no super-government trying to rule them from a distant location, until the time of Sauron's arising. The blessed life of the Shire is interrupted by the presence of a ring that had been forged ages ago by the evil Sauron, who meant to rule all of Middle-earth by its malignant power. The ring had been lost for some ages, until an adventurous hobbit, Mr. Bilbo Baggins, happened upon it, as recounted in The Hobbit. Bilbo has no idea of its origin, power, or evil nature. He only knows that it makes him invisible. At the opening of The Lord of the Rings, the ring of power passes to Frodo Baggins, who was adopted by Bilbo upon the death of Frodo's parents. They live in the town of Hobbiton. The grand adventure begins when the evil Nazgul, men corrupted and transformed by the power of Sauron, come at Sauron's bidding to recapture the ring. If they find it, Sauron's power will have no limits. The Shire and all of Middle-earth will be entirely under his dark tyranny, and all its denizens his miserable slaves. The only way to avoid this dismal end is to destroy the ring in the fires of Mount Doom, unhappily located in Mordor, Sauron's own land. By providence, Frodo is chosen to bear the ring to Mount Doom, and this journey, with all its perils, battles, and triumphant and horrible moments, constitutes the adventure of the Lord of the Rings. The free and peaceful lives of everyone in Middle-earth, and especially Frodo's Shire, depend upon the success of this seemingly hopeless task. I will not attempt to recreate the story before the reader's imagination. There is only one way into the enchanted world of Tolkien, and that is to let the spell of his words work its magic and draw you in. I shall instead concentrate on those central points we have been stressing in our analysis all along. The real hero. Of course, there are many heroes in the story. Along with Frodo, we have Aragorn, the great king, Gimli, the brave dwarf, Legolas, the dauntless elf, Theoden, the noble king of Rohan, and others. But the greatest hero is Frodo's gardener and loyal companion, Samwise Gamgee, the foot soldier who looks after Frodo, who literally carries him through to Mount Doom. As Tolkien later related, Sam's character was based upon the solid soldiers of the war, the privates, rather than their aristocratic officers. My Sam Gamgee is indeed a reflection of the English soldier, of the privates and batmen I knew in the 1914 war, and recognized as so far superior to myself. A batman for the Brits is a soldier valet assigned to a commissioned officer to look after him and his things, just as Sam Gamgee looked after Frodo. Sam is about as common a hobbit as one can imagine, unsure of himself, exceedingly humble, and a bit of a bumbler, but sure of his devotion to Frodo and the Shire, and of the fundamental difference between good and evil. It is just this devotion, the courage that arises from it, and his plain common sense and humility that ultimately save Middle-earth. He is the common man, the man of good sense, the man of the soil whose virtues arise from the simplicity and integrity of his way of life and his character. He is precisely the kind of creature despised by great planners in far-off locations who want to impose their rule upon a hapless yokel population. He is a hater of tyranny and a lover of ordered liberty. A dangerous hobbit indeed. One particularly poignant scene is well worth visiting because it reveals the way Tolkien, and any conservative, understands good stories to work. Finding himself at the very heart of a real adventure, with real danger, real death, and real evil, Samwise realizes that all the great tales he loved in his childhood were preparing him for the drama in which he now finds himself. That is an essential point about good stories. They prepare us for the real battles. As he and Frodo, along with the misshapen, Caliban-like Gollum, climb ever closer to their destination, Sam reflects on the connection between the great stories of his youth and the great drama of his present life in the context of their dismal journey through the ruined lands of Sauron. "I don't like anything here at all," remarks Frodo disconsolately. "Step or stone, breath or bone, earth, air, and water all seem accursed. But so our path is laid." Sam replies, "Yes, that's so, and we shouldn't be here at all if we'd known more about it before we started. But I suppose it's often that way. The brave things in the old tales and songs, Mr. Frodo. Adventures, as I used to call them. I used to think that they were things the wonderful folk of the stories went out and looked for, because they wanted them, because they were exciting and life was a bit dull. A kind of sport, as you might say. But that's not the way of it with the tales that really mattered, or the ones that stay in the mind. Folk seem to have been just landed in them, usually. Their paths were laid that way, as you put it. But I expect they had lots of chances, like us, of turning back, only they didn't. And if they had, we shouldn't know, because they'd have been forgotten. We hear about those as just went on, and not all to a good end, mind you. At least not to what folk inside a story and not outside it call a good end. You know, coming home and finding things all right, though not quite the same, like old Mr. Bilbo. But those aren't always the best tales to hear, though they may be the best tales to get landed in. I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into. That is what we all have to wonder, especially when we find ourselves in similarly dark times. As a friend of mine once said, regarding the condition of our culture, the orcs are in the Shire. Orcs, again, are the demon creatures of Middle-earth, the willing slaves of Sauron, the polar opposite to elves. They live for destruction, hate beauty, and worship power over nature and over others. They are the very picture of our deepest corruption, just as the elves are the vision of our lost natural innocence and power. To battle orcs, we must, like Samwise Gamgee, gather strength from the great tales. We find ourselves in a particular place and time, confronting real evils that must be dealt with. We have the freedom to turn back, to try to continue a life of ease and make the best of it as the sky darkens. But we also have the freedom to trudge on and do what we must. The freedom we do not have, however, is to be neutral or be in another time. We shall be judged by God and others by what we did or didn't do in the face of the evils that confront us, by what kind of world we leave those that live after us. As Gandalf the Wizard later counsels, other evils there are that may come, for Sauron is himself but a servant or emissary. Yet it is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule. After the ring is destroyed and the great adventure is complete, Sam returns with the other hobbits, Frodo, Merry, and Pippin, to Hobbiton in the Shire. Unfortunately, the writers of the film saw fit to cut out Chapter 8 of The Return of the King, The Scouring of the Shire, which is a brilliant presentation of the attempt to bureaucratize the Shire through fear by ruffians and lickspittles of the fallen wizard Saruman, renamed Sharky. The Scouring of the Shire is a must-read for conservatives because it so vividly portrays the kind of fear that causes good folks to cower and acquiesce, the kind of damage to the good life that petty tyranny brings, and the kind of bravery necessary to throw it off. After a battle in the Shire, good order is restored. Samwise marries his love, Rose Cotton, has 13 children, and because of his great bravery, fame, goodness, and wisdom, is elected mayor of Hobbiton 7 times. He is known as Master Samwise, but still tends his own garden. But while Samwise the Great is certainly a hero, he is not the only hero in the book. Men with chests and kings with crowns. The Lord of the Rings is a book of men with chests, or more exactly, hobbits, elves, dwarves, and men with chests. It's not a book for the likes of Gaius and Titius, who, deathly afraid of the horrors of war, seek to make men without chests and peace at any cost. There are times when the evil is such that we must fight, and battle demands men with chests, noble men, great men, both wise and strong. If there is one single virtue that stands out in Tolkien's masterpiece, it is courage, the manly virtue of those who must fight against those who would enslave them and turn to ruin all they love. In portraying manly courage, the 3 films are extraordinary. The battles are grand, the trials are harrowing, the danger is palpable, and the intensity of the bravery of the main characters swells the hearts of the viewers. Every boy who hopes to become a man, every man who strives to become a better man, and every woman who yearns to know what a real man is, should throw themselves into the movies. That having been said, there is one central and serious defect in the film's portrayal of the character of Aragorn. In the film, he is an extraordinary and extremely brave man. In the book, he is a magnificent king, so glorious that when he chooses to reveal himself fully, both friend and enemy shrink in his sight. To cite a vivid example, in the film, when Aragorn, Gimli the dwarf, and Legolas the elf are come upon by Éomer and the noble riders of Rohan, Aragorn reacts submissively to Éomer's challenge. In the book, Aragorn does no such thing. Rather, he reveals his true identity, with quite the opposite effect. Aragorn threw back his cloak. The elven sheath glittered as he grasped it, and the bright blade of Andúril, his legendary sword, shone like a sudden flame as he swept it out. "Elendil," he cried, "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and am called Elisar, the Elfstone, Dunadan, the heir of Isildur Elendil's son of Gondor. Here is the sword that was broken and is forged again. Will you aid me or thwart me? Choose swiftly." Gimli and Legolas looked at their companion in amazement, for they had not seen him in this mood before. He seemed to have grown in stature, while Éomer shrunk, and in his living face they caught a brief vision of the power and majesty of kings of stone. For a moment, it seemed to the eyes of Legolas that a white flame flickered on the brows of Aragorn, like a shining crown. Éomer stepped back, and a look of awe was in his face. He cast down his proud eyes. "These are indeed strange days," he muttered. "Dreams and legends spring to life out of the grass." Here is revealed a true king, not just an ordinary man, but something of legend, like King Arthur, who suddenly appears. The entire drive of the 3rd book, The Return of the King, depends on this vision of a great king, a thing of seeming myth that suddenly intrudes into real life to fulfill an age-old prophecy. To reduce him merely to a brave man, as the film does, tarnishes the crowning of the book, the climactic coronation of Aragorn at Gondor. In the film, Aragorn takes up his kingship with all the sheepishness of a man who really believes that kings should be replaced, at best, by presidents. In the book, things are much different when the crown is placed on Aragorn's head. But when Aragorn arose, all that beheld him gazed in silence, for it seemed to them that he was revealed to them now for the first time. Tall as the sea kings of old, he stood above all that were near. Ancient of days he seemed, and yet in the flower of manhood, and wisdom sat upon his brow, and strength and healing were in his hands, and a light was about him. The failure to capture the true glory of the king is a major flaw in an otherwise very good adaptation of the book. But it is a very great flaw, one that goes beyond cheapening the inner grandeur of Tolkien's imaginary world and unfits us for two essential truths. The first comes from Aristotle. We live in a democratic age, one that is all too easily tarnished by envy, so that we find it hard to believe that there is extraordinary goodness, courage, and wisdom. This leads us to a fundamentally confused view of kingship, that all kings are tyrants. But recall that Aristotle argued, quite reasonably, that we can distinguish between good and bad kings, true kings and tyrants, just as we can distinguish, in regard to majority rule, between the majority that rules for the true common good and the majority that rules for its own selfish interests, republican and democratic rule. Even more startling and reasonable, for Aristotle, it was better to live under the rule of a good king than in an oligarchy or a democracy. But even more unsettling to us, remember that Aristotle stated quite soberly that if there were one person preeminent in virtue, a man of supreme goodness, it would be good for everyone to obey such a person gladly as their king. If there were a man like Aragorn, as the book presents him, we should welcome him as king. If you cannot feel that deep down, then the Lord of the Rings will be entirely lost on you. Outlandish? No Jew or Christian can deny it, and further, if you cannot feel it deep down, the Bible as well will be entirely lost on you. The Bible is a great epic drama centered around kingship, the kingship of God, the kingship of David, and the culmination of the deepest desire for the return of the king, the fulfilling of all prophecies of one who is to come, as if out of legend, the King of Kings, heir of David. That will be part of our theme when we look at the Bible in the next chapter, but we have one more aspect of the Lord of the Rings we must look into, the ring itself. One ring to rule them all. In the mythology of Middle-earth, there are actually many more rings than the One Ring. 9 rings for men, 7 for dwarves, and 3 for the elves. Shortly after the original forging of these rings of power, the evil Sauron made the One Ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. The evil ring is the ring of greatest power, but its very making was defined by malevolence. It is a power that cannot be used for good, no matter how good the intentions of the wearer, no matter how great the peril from which such power could deliver good people. That is why it presents the greatest temptation for those who face the evil Sauron. That is why it must be destroyed. The presence of the One Ring represents many subtle facets of evil, but 3 are particularly worth our attention. First, it represents an evil deeper and far darker than mere hobbits can understand, just as the battle between good and evil extends far beyond the level of the Shire to unimagined heights and depths of reality. Aragorn is greater, Gandalf the Wizard is greater, Sauron is greater, the battle for Middle-earth is greater. As the hobbit Pippin says to Merry after the Battle of Pelennor Fields, referring to Aragorn, "Was there ever anyone like him? Except Gandalf, of course. Dear me, we can't live long on the heights." "No," said Merry, "I can't. Not yet, at any rate. But at least, Pippin, we can now see them and honor them. It is best to love first what you are fitted to love, I suppose. You must start somewhere and have some roots, and the soil of the Shire is deep. Still, there are things deeper and higher, and not a gaffer could tend his garden in what he calls peace but for them, whether he knows about them or not. I am glad that I know about them, a little." The evil they face, the evil they fight against for the sake of the Shire, reaches far beyond their reckoning, just as the good that ultimately protects it. Yet the very ordinary hobbits were essential in the overthrow of the evil, essential in the battle on the side of the good that rose above their vision as well. We hobbits must recognize that we are part of a far larger cosmic battle. Second, the One Ring represents the essential and often painful self-limitation of the good man who could use an evil means to a seemingly good end, who is sorely tempted to use an evil means to a noble end, but forces himself to turn away. This is the courage of a true conservative when faced with moral limits, limits that could be transgressed and grant us some great benefit, but which, once transgressed, turn upon and corrupt the will that crossed the sacred boundary. If we could save a man's life by harvesting live organs from human beings raised for this purpose, produced through in vitro fertilization and kept in a kind of warehouse, should we? If we could save a woman embarrassment and hardships by helping her have an abortion, should we? If we could improve the genetic strength and future health of our race by systematically eliminating the less genetically endowed through prenatal screening, should we? A true conservative says no. Good can never be purchased with evil. The conservative accepts moral limits as a matter of honor and duty and even prudence. The liberal, however, brushes these limits aside, laughing at old-fashioned notions of good and evil, and rushes forward on a path of presumed progress, using the magic wand of technology and the force of law to remake man as he thinks he should be made. Finally, we must not overlook the obvious. The ring is a single entity, a single power that ultimately resides in a single source, Sauron in Mordor. With it, he desires to rule all of Middle-earth, bending everything to his will. He presents the very essence of totalitarianism, the desire to override all the real wills of real persons, in all their intractable variety and local color, and reform all that is below him into one master plan. He imposes government from the top down, crushing everything in his path as of no consequence. The Shire and all its lovely towns, as well Lothlorien, the land of the elves, and Gondor, the home of man. These and all the other places of independent peoples and particular ways of life must be destroyed or reduced to servitude. One cannot fail to see, in this great struggle of Middle-earth, and in the dark designs of Sauron, the familiar contours of 20th century totalitarianism, and the grave possibility that its threat extends into the 21st. I am not suggesting that liberalism, in its desire to centralize power in the federal government and then in a world government, partakes of the malice of Hitler, Stalin, or Sauron. But what they all do share is a desire to use power to dominate others. Liberals fail to realize a central moral lesson of the Lord of the Rings. Such power itself will take even the best of intentions to the darkest of ends.
And that was the Lord of the Rings, 10 books every conservative must read, plus 4 not to miss and 1 imposter by Benjamin-Wiker, Ph.D. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.